how do we work with it to dismantle that system? And so for me, as a child of the transition, Palestine, Israel, the Nakba, Germany, the Holocaust against the Jews, and other racially marked populations like the Sinti and Roma, and South Africa have always been interconnected. And of course, historically, they are connected intellectually, ideologically, administratively. They've all drawn off one another in learning how to kind of construct an administrative system of more and more effective repression, ethnic cleansing or genocide, scorched earth, facts on the ground, a remaking of a landscape and of its populations in order to sustain a myth of racial supremacy.
Our guest today is a good friend of mine, the person who introduced me to certain places in Palestine that as a Palestinian I wasn't aware of. She is the director of the Center of Humanities Research, and she has amazing stories about her family, about her background, and about her current work. Let's dive in and speak to Heidi. Heidi, thanks so much for coming to the show.
Thank you, Aziz. It's such an honor.
The honor is ours. We spoke briefly before we start about your family and about your brother, your parents. How was the relationship during apartheid with the family? How we guys interact on the supper table, and how did that shape your life afterwards?
Thanks. That's a great question. I learned from my parents what it means to be a human being, and that you're not simply being a human being. It's how you behave. It's how you act. That you can't be human if you're not engaging and interacting with other humans. I learned from my parents that any other human being is in their position by an accident of birth, and that the person who is hungry and asks for food could be me, it could be my father, it could be my child. And that had a profound effect on me. I don't know if they realized that that was my first lesson in political morality. I didn't come from a political family. I guess like most white and Jewish families during apartheid, they were intimidated to speak out, even though at the supper table, the evil nature of apartheid in South Africa was often discussed. My parents, and my father in particular, whose parents had been refugees from Nazi Germany, was very moved and angry by forced removals in particular. And I think decades later, when I became involved in, with every fiber of my being in supporting the cause of Palestinian freedom, and I should add Jewish freedom because it's connected, my father was nervous about that, and nervous also because they received a lot of criticism from the community. But when I explained to him that he was also responsible for teaching me what it means to be a human being, and I was just extending this inheritance of learning from my parents, he understood and he accepted it. He has Alzheimer's disease now, and I deeply love my Alzheimer's father. He's forgotten all of this, but I can never forget it. And I feel as if he's given me a blessing to do the work I do.
You grew up in Johannesburg, and your schooling was there. University was there as well, or was it in other part of the country?
I grew up in Johannesburg. I became a teenager during the states of emergency in South Africa. And at an age of moral conscientization, I looked around and I saw the country burning. I saw a regime killing its people, or people it disavowed through race, and it repressed, and it hunted and humiliated. And I felt either I need to join the struggle or I need to leave. And I didn't have the courage to join the struggle. And so I left. I went to Israel to live on a kibbutz. And I thought that would be an exit from the predicament of being a white person in South Africa, or someone who was given the status of whiteness.
Was that in the 80s?
Yeah. And so 85, 86, the height of the states of emergency, off I went to another apartheid state just before the first Intifada. And I went to live and work on a kibbutz near Netanya on the Sharon Plains. And while most anti-apartheid, Jewish anti-apartheid activists that I know went to Israel and immediately saw the signs of Israeli apartheid, not the same as South Africa, but its own form and expression, I didn't see, I didn't notice. In fact, when I went from inside 48 to places on the West Bank, like Kalkilia, for example, I would write back to my family and say, really, things that only a white South African could have said in those years, things like, or maybe a American, or the Arabs are very sweet and kind. And, things, when I read, I've kept that archive because I think it's very important to understand the psychology of complicity, and that we shouldn't always write off everybody from the other side, because there are always seeds of moral conscience. And the work is, I think, on the shoulders of people like me to work with those, the doubters, to bring them over, to say, actually, humanity this is what we're called to do, and it's difficult, and you might lose family and friends and standing in your community, but you will live with yourself up to your deathbed. You will be able to look at yourself in the mirror and say, yes, this is the right struggle.
I want to go back to Palestine in a bit, but firstly, I want to get to an organization that you worked with in South Africa for liberation. What was this organization? How did you get in touch with it?
I was very interested in the process of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I had a very strong criticism of the process because I felt that the rush to reconciliation was dangerous, that there needed to be a stop of the war, a stop of the violence, but that the terms of reconciliation needed to be provided by the formerly oppressed and not by the former oppressors. I read about the organization. At that point, they were called WECAT, later Direct Action Center for Peace and Memory. It was an organization of mainly men who had been freedom fighters in the military wing of the anti-apartheid struggle, of the liberation movement. And Direct Action Center did public and social pedagogy programs, visiting sites of massacre, of resistance, of street battles, or of major kind of historical events. moving with participants from the center of the city all the way to its edges in Khayelitsha to understand the layers of historical and systemic processes, global and more local, that have made modern South Africa, and particularly the struggle for liberation in post-apartheid South Africa, to understand the long duration and the different phases, that it wasn't direct and linear. It was difficult. There were huge setbacks for many decades over different periods. The decimation of leadership, the imprisonment of political leaders, and yet always another generation to pick up the flame, so to speak. And this was an organization that also told stories about the artists, the writers, the musicians, the intellectual and cultural work that grew up in the areas that have been kind of marginalized from the way that the city imagines itself and its history. And I read about this in the newspaper, and I approached the organization. I went to meet with them with a colleague who's actually at Stellenbosch University. And we had a first conversation, and they said to me, you know, it's not automatic that we'll just take you with. And if you're an academic, you can't write about this. You can't extract and instrumentalize what we do. And I was excited by that, by the invitation into a deep engagement with them that took seriously the systemic and historical asymmetries between where I came from and where they came from. And because we were age peers, we would often compare, you know, this is what I was doing in 1984. This is what they were doing in 1984. And in some ways, the extremes of our stories at the same moments together became a composite of life under apartheid and what resistance to it meant. And that organization, I engaged with and then went to work with from 1999 until 2005, 2006. And it was formative for me because when we would have conversations, smoking cigarettes on the fire escape outside the office, one story, they would often reminisce about their experiences in exile, their experiences in Angola and in the underground inside South Africa, but also during their military training, which was during the Cold War. And so that was often in Eastern European countries, in East Germany, in Bulgaria, but also in Moscow. And one story that really landed in my heart, remember, I had been a young Zionist. I'd been to Palestine as a young Zionist. In other words, I'd been to Israel and had been educated into the denial of Palestine, which is part of, I think, being a Zionist. A strange acknowledgement and denial at the same time. Denial is always a little, I think, clue of a deeper unconscious acknowledgement. But that anecdote that was shared while we were smoking our cigarettes was one of my colleagues remembered training in the forests outside of Moscow in the snow, and the deep silence of the snow. And as you know, as in most or many liberation movements, there are repertoires of songs that people draw on for morale building. And my colleague spoke about training in the silence, in the forests, in the night, in the snow, and hearing far away, deep in the forest, the strains of Arabic song, and listening closely and coming to realize that these were Palestinian freedom fighters. Now, this is in the 1980s. And then the anecdote turned and my colleagues started to talk about the meaning of the Palestinian struggle. And
at that time, you were not kind of formally introduced to these things, or were you?
No, I had been exposed to deep indoctrination. And so up until that point, growing up in South Africa under apartheid, people like me were indoctrinated to fear attacks by terrorists, in inverted commas. And here it was 20, 30 years later, I was working with people who had been the kind of labeled terrorists. And so that kind of crumbling of one understanding that young people were indoctrinated into to be replaced by another understanding that my colleagues at Direct Action Center had been fighting for my liberation as well as a human being, to not be a white person, to be a human, to be able to participate in rebuilding a society that treasured first and foremost freedom, dignity, equality. Suddenly that kind of cognitive disconnect collapsed and it reconnected to Palestine. And I started to think about that indoctrination. You know, once you start realizing what you have been taught is a form of indoctrination, you start to see it much more critically. And the inner reality of that starts to crumble. And that was a key moment that introduced me to the Palestinian struggle.
Heidi, you come from a family that faced, a survival family from the Holocaust. And then your work was based on the reconciliation in South Africa and the criticism of that in the landscaping. How would you put the comparison between this and that and Palestine, if that's the right term?
Yes, thank you. So this family inheritance has been formative for me in the work I've done over many, many years, particularly around reading the silences and erasures of the past, of mass violence, of state violence, of genocide, of displacement, of apartheid. The landscape always, it remembers, and for one who learns to read or is taught actually how to read the landscape, it starts to be translated, and those scars, those signs, those clues become visible, even though they've always been visible internally and externally for survivors of these catastrophic state crimes. And so for me, my family's experience in Germany, apartheid in South Africa, the ongoing Nakba in Palestine, have always been interconnected since that kind of consciousness and awareness took hold after just and during the South African transition. The South African transition for me, I'm a child of the transition. South African writer Sisonke Msimang talks about herself as a child of the transition, someone who comes of age during, with one foot in apartheid and the other foot in democracy. Yeah. And it was through the transition that rather than sanitizing history, airbrushing the past, undoing or flattening the messy chaos of human life and its existence, I went into the interconnections, the knots, the complexity. Complexity isn't complicated. It just means that there are multiple pieces that combine to make a system what it is, in ways that aren't always knowable in advance or even analyzable in their aftermath. So I think in South Africa, we're still trying to understand what was apartheid. What has it done to us? Why does it keep repeating itself, even when the laws are dismantled? And what do we do with that? How do we work with it to dismantle that system? And so for me, as a child of the transition, Palestine, Israel, the Nakba, Germany, the Holocaust against the Jews, and other racially marked populations like the Sinti and Roma, and South Africa have always been interconnected. And of course, historically, they are connected intellectually, ideologically, administratively. They've all drawn off one another in learning how to kind of construct an administrative system of more and more effective repression, ethnic cleansing or genocide, scorched earth, facts on the ground, a remaking of a landscape and of its populations in order to sustain a myth of racial supremacy and what Muhammad Ayash calls overlordship on a land.
You were involved at some point in South Africa in a campaign to stop the Jewish, what do you call it? Jewish National Fund.
That's right.
What is the Jewish National Fund and why were you involved in that?
Thank you. That's a great question and a really important one to get out in the world. The Jewish National Fund was established under a different name around 1901, to purchase land across historic Palestine as part of the colonial project of Zionism. I think Zionism has different aspects. One has been a colonial project, different in many ways to other settler colonial contexts, but also sharing a lot with other settler colonial contexts. The Jewish National Fund aimed to acquire land across historic Palestine and then to hold that land not just for a future sovereign state or Jewish polity, but for the Jewish people as a people, not only as a kind of a national formation, which is as we know, a modern invention, across the world in perpetuity. So its Hebrew name, Keren Kayemet LeYisrael, means the perpetual fund for Israel, as in the children of Israel. And I think the modern state of Israel, 76-year-old state, uses the conflation with the 7,000-year-old biblical kind of connections in very cynical and politically instrumental ways. But the Jewish National Fund, after the establishment of the state in 1948, through the Guardian of Absentee Property, which was an office set up by the state in 1949 in anticipation of the 1950 Absentee Property Act passed by the Knesset, which took all of the lands that were held by Palestinians who had been expelled and ethnically pushed out, cleansed is problematic, but ethnically displaced outside of what became the boundaries or the boundaries of the modern state of Israel. The Jewish National Fund took guardianship and held these lands in perpetuity. So more than 90% of Israel's public lands are held by an administrative structure in which the Jewish National Fund has a major presence. It's a very powerful organization. It's been deeply implicated in the indoctrination of Zionism and Zionist values for young Jews around the world. And one of its iconic tactics and tools was the blue and white collection box, which shows the money box. And so we were told as kids, you're putting your money in to make the desert bloom. We thought we were doing something noble and wonderful. We didn't realize that I didn't realize that this was feeding into a colonial revisionist project. And of course, the blue and white tin has all of historic Palestine on its map. It always has had. It never had partitioned Palestine with the boundaries of Israel. It always had the maximalist kind of image of the Zionist movement on its front. And not only did the JNF plant forests across the land after 1948, it planted 86 new national forests named after countries of donors. South Africa forest, American, USA forest, South Africa. So before I give you all the names, I won't give you all the names. Let me say that, so I accompanied a South African delegation to Bethlehem to a conference in 2009. And we went to look for our country forest. We did an excursion with Eitan Bronstein, one of the founders of Zochrot, very important Israeli organization that brings the Nakba into Israeli and into Hebrew language consciousness. Precisely not to appropriate it, but in order to address it and to address the foundational denial of Palestinian existence in historic Palestine. And so we went to Canada Park in the Latrun Basin, I think to Emwas, and we walked through, what had been the village of Emwas. There's a beautiful film made by Dima Abu Ghosh called On Memories of Emwas, beautiful film about that Nakba village. And he spoke about South Africa Forest, and we decided, 5, 6 of us, we're going to South Africa Forest. And that's in the Galilee, how do you say it in Arabic? Jalil? No.
Jalil.
In Jalil, near Tiberias, and we went there to South Africa Forest to look for the Nakba village called Lubia.
And this is where you filmed.
And this is where our film was set. So Lubia was one of the biggest villages in the northern part of historic Palestine by 1947-48. Almost 3,000 people lived there, and there were many wells and many, there was a masjid, there was an inn for travelers. There were cultural clubs. It was a kind of a crossroads in that part of, historic Palestine, at the crossroads with Syria, with Lebanon, with
South African forest was built.
So South Africa Forest was planted in 1965 on top of the ruins of Lubia. And we visited it in 2009. And one colleague who's a practicing Muslim was fasting. It was Ramadan. And he went into this maqam that was there to pray. And the rest of us were in the burial ground. And my one colleague who had experienced himself forced removals and had lost his house and his family's house and been removed to a town that the apartheid regime in South Africa renamed Ver Genoeg, which means far away enough. And he just said, "This, I understand this." And then he said, "Someone needs to make a film about this." And I said, "I'm going to," because I, at that moment, remembered that in the 1980s, I had visited South Africa Forest as a young Zionist and had gone to the Israeli military museum near the forest called the Golani Brigade that had conquered and ethnically cleansed Lubia and other villages in the region. And that then took me into a process of over 4 or 5 years, engaging with Mark Kaplan, a filmmaker, and with Mahmoud Issa, social historian of Lubia, and with many Palestinian intellectuals, researchers, historians, archivists, to really understand what happened at Lubia and what happened with South Africa Forest, and to find a way to hold the two together, because the destruction of Lubia is the making of South Africa Forest. And it's important, we felt, to tell the story as an interconnected story, but also as a metaphor for the wider process of erasing all of the Arabic place names, 8,000, 9,000 place names across historic Palestine were Hebraicized. They were first marked on the new state's maps as destroyed villages with the Hebrew term harus, which means destroyed, and then later maps erased the term harus so that the mark of destruction could itself be erased. And the new place names would come to shape the new narrative of the new Israeli nation.
And while he's talking, like there's like a million questions in my head, but how would you describe to people who are indoctrinated? That's the term that you used in Zionism around the world, not just in South Africa, and then with someone who were there and then part of the reconciliation. How would you, and then went and visited and participated, I don't know, especially with what's happening now in Palestine and Gaza. How do you change your perspective, and with someone who's doing the most now, and you went there and you try to participate in making a film about what's happening, how would you say the next generation must participate in these things and engage with the Palestinians?
I would start with it. The struggle is led by Palestinians. I would say that the next generation have a clarity that my generation didn't. They see the genocide. They see the destruction. They see the cult of militarism, which is on steroids. And many of them have left the fold. They understand that the indoctrination is ongoing, but they also see that this is no longer an authentic narrative. They understand that the safety and security of Jewish people everywhere in the world is only possible if the struggle for freedom, egalitarianism, equality, democracy, dignity is undertaken wherever we live. We have to be part of our societies. I think the younger generation do understand this, and they're fearless and inspirational. That said, I do think it's difficult for Jewish Israelis who are really locked in a totalitarian system, which is deeply punishing and repressive of any kind of dissent. And my own invitation to any young Jewish person, to any young Israeli is, there are people like me who would be honored to work with you, to cross over, to undo that internal wall, because that's where it starts. It's an internal process, psychological, it's emotional. It's so important to have to have people to ask stupid questions, to ask ignorant questions, to ask questions that are racist but don't yet have a kind of self-understanding. That's not the burden for Palestinians. That's the work that I think Jewish allies in the struggle have to undertake. At the same time, I think for all non-Palestinians, we're not targeted. We're not being annihilated. And as horrific as this genocide is, and as helpless as we all feel, no matter what we're doing, and there is a young generation, I know in South Africa, South African Jews for Free Palestine is being led by such a beautiful, inspirational generation of fearless and courageous truth speakers and freedom makers. Those alliances are absolutely critical. But for all of us, as helpless as we feel, no matter what people are doing, and no matter how much we're marching and petitioning and working in different ways in supporting very actively and very directly the struggle, we're not at risk in the same way. We have a freedom. We're protected by a Bill of Rights here, and we have to remember that. Nonetheless, we have to be able to tell our children and our grandchildren that we did everything we could, and that even if we couldn't stop this, we went to the end of our ability and capacity and never stopped. And with our allies across the world, particularly North America, we have to find ways for our governments to impose military sanctions at very least. The bombing has to stop, and the only way we can do that is by pressurizing our governments wherever we are.
I want to go back from Palestine to South Africa and end up with this question, that for this generation here in South Africa, what would you say that the new South Africa is there to offer for them? We are sitting in this beautiful research center that you're running here. What do you guys trying to offer here for the young generation that kind of reliving the situation here in South Africa, who didn't participate in the reconciliation or in the old apartheid system?
Thank you. That's such a beautiful question. The Center for Humanities Research is a research center at the University of the Western Cape. And we're sitting here in Woodstock in this refurbished old school building that was established for young white children on the edge, on the side of the municipal boundary of the historically white city.
A lot of history.
There's a lot of history, and there's a lot of symbolic reclamation and justice in a university like UWC coming into the city. All of our work, all of our students, all of our artists in residence, the resident puppetry company, Kwanda, who you met when you entered the building, are working here on an endeavor to think into the problem of the post-apartheid. Think into the problem of how do we use our intellectual, artistic, cultural, political resources that come through a broad movement of liberation across many centuries to rethink the limits of the transition. We had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission process. You cannot build a society on a commission or on a legal process or on a process that identified individual perpetrators and victims. Society needs to be rebuilt through systemic change, including economic change. It's going to take enormous work. We have to be courageous in our criticism. And we have to also be courageous in our acknowledgements. We can't paint everyone with one brush. We have to inhabit the contradictions and the paradoxes, the huge disappointments, the huge mistakes of post-colonial, post-apartheid South Africa, of which there are many, including huge political mistakes. But we're all implicated in the possibility of building something else. And because I work now in an institution of higher education, how does education open up a space to learn, to think anew, to theorize, to criticize, to create propositions through the aesthetic and artistic imagination that might help us open up more space in order to truly change our society? We need fierce and courageous conversations. Apartheid and settler colonialism can never be forgiven, forgotten, or diminished. In fact, we need to understand them more. We need sharper analysis. We need multi and interdisciplinary analysis. We need political economists and astrophysicists and artists and humanities scholars and social scientists thinking together, because what we've inherited in the post-apartheid is much more pernicious and stubborn in the way of apartheid repeating itself than we could have ever anticipated. And then our incredible constitution can intervene or change.
Heidi, thanks a lot for your time. I really
As is.
appreciate everything. I'm going to leave a link for the research center and for your work in the bio. And until next time, goodbye.